Alright, today I want to make a video about Bitcoin, a subscriber special. Now, you might have seen that I've been doing some pieces about Bitcoin over the last couple of months. There's been this big one I put out a few days ago called iToken. Alright, there's been another one called, we're looking at Countertrade in Bitcoin, and another one looking at the ideology of some of the messaging in Bitcoin. Alright, now, some people have been asking me, why have you been writing these pieces about Bitcoin? After all, my newsletter started as a kind of an attempt to visualize the existing monetary system and sort of like try to do some kind of demystification of the monetary system. And the Bitcoin pieces sometimes feel like a bit of a distraction potentially, or a bit of a sort of side battle going on. And yeah, this is a point of tension for me. I'm on the one hand trying to do stuff around revealing the existing monetary system, but then it kind of comes into conflict with the fact that in the media right now there is so much hype about Bitcoin. So I often feel a need to try and do some myth busting about what Bitcoin actually is and how it relates to the normal monetary system. Now, one of the problems is there's a particular story that comes out of the Bitcoin community about how Bitcoin relates to the existing monetary system. And often that story is pretty deeply flawed. On the one hand, it presents often a straw man account of how the actual monetary system is structured, and often then presents a straw man account of how Bitcoin supposedly combats it. Okay, so one of the reasons why I've been doing all these sort of pieces about, which look like little sort of like sometimes like pedantic attacks in some of my pieces on Bitcoin, is precisely because I'm trying to pick apart that narrative such that we can build some material to help us actually navigate the sort of topsy-turvy public debate about Bitcoin. Okay, so I just thought I would like try to give a bit of background as to my involvement in the Bitcoin community, where I currently stand, and what exactly my agenda is when I'm doing these pieces on it, right? Because often it doesn't come across necessarily in the way that I intend it. Okay, and there's different people with different sort of takes on what's going on in the community. So I'm just trying to like get everyone on the same page. First thing I want to say is I've actually been involved in Bitcoin, and especially in the past used to use it quite a lot, probably since about 2010 or 2011. All right, was the first time I started getting involved in Bitcoin. I actually exchanged about 14 or 15 of my original book called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance. I exchanged about 15 copies of that for Bitcoin, right? So I actually had like quite a lot of Bitcoin in the past. But then I went about trying to actually experiment with using that like as an actual currency to see whether it was possible to actually use this thing as a currency. So I have quite a sort of deep history with attempting to use Bitcoin as a currency system. Now, you might have noticed I do a lot of critiques about Bitcoin as money, all right? And partially this comes out of my historical attempts to use Bitcoin as money, right? So it doesn't come out of nowhere. And a lot of my more recent pieces about, if you've seen the piece I've done about Bitcoin Countertrade is the primary way I use to describe my activities that I use to engage with in the Bitcoin world, attempting to use it for exchange. Okay, now we can go into that, but this is the way I've written about Bitcoin has shifted over the years as I've gained more experience about it with it. One of the slightly frustrating elements of the current debate is that there's lots of new people coming into Bitcoin, and many of them are extremely excited and have been pulled in by all the whole kind of like marketing apparatus around it, and have developed a whole sort of, have staked almost their economic, or both their economic livelihood, but also their reputations on it. Okay, so one of the most frustrating things for me as a public commentator when I'm sort of talking about Bitcoin and I do critiques about it, you immediately have hundreds of these pundits who will come in and sort of cast you as being some kind of ignorant fool who hasn't yet seen the light about Bitcoin, all right? Which is, of course, is quite a grating experience when you've been involved with it for such a long time and have done a lot of analysis over it and actually have a lot of experience of using it over the years, okay? So I often get really sort of, if any of you follow me on Twitter, you'll see I'm often frequently attacked by all these kind of like crypto, what I might call crypto bros, okay? This whole community of these guys who constantly like trying to pump Bitcoin and all this kind of Bitcoin intelligentsia that's developed. There's a whole kind of community of people who sort of produce think pieces around it, but their basic agenda is always to promote Bitcoin, right? So the pieces that they produce, much like the sort of theological pieces produced by, Christian priests, the pieces that are produced are often can be quite sophisticated, but there's always an underlying agenda, which is the tokens must be promoted. Okay, so this is quite a difficult dynamic that I have to constantly deal with, and of course, it leads to a lot of frustration on my part. So as I was saying, the tone of my pieces has shifted over the years as I've gained more experience, but also as the demographic of the community has changed in Bitcoin, this means I've been pushed more and more into the outside of that community, as it were. So in the early days, my pieces I was writing about Bitcoin, I wrote one of the very first explainers of it, which was super popular. I've compiled these big lists of academic research on it. I did all sorts of things to sort of talk about the tokens, and I even promoted them, right? And in those early days, I was mostly involved in thinking about almost the distributed nature of the system. Okay, so we're looking at the fact that there wasn't, they weren't going via the banking system. And I was at that time doing a lot of critique around the banking sector and how you might challenge the power of the banking sector. So of course, something that was able to bypass the banking sector was seen as a possible, very positive thing. So that a lot of my analysis was in this frame of the decentralization aspect of Bitcoin. Okay. Now there's one big thing you got to realize about the original sort of Bitcoin political vision, as it were. Okay. The big thing you got to realize is that there's two conceptually separate forks to it, or two conceptually separate parts to it. All right, the first part is all about decentralization, okay? So decentralization, this idea that the existing monetary system has a series of centralized players, or you might call them an oligopoly of players, who sort of preside over the monetary system, all right? And in this system, by contrast, is decentralized or spread over a wide range of people, okay? Now that was the original one element of the original Bitcoin sort of political message, was decentralization. Now, decentralization as a concept is actually quite politically ambiguous, or it's politically, should we say, quite wide-ranging. You have people from all over the political spectrum who believe in the idea of decentralization, however conceived, at least in some basic form, the idea of spreading power, okay? From left-wing anarchists through to like far-right kind of breakaway kind of, ranchland libertarians who like just want to sort of like have nobody bother them, through to like people in, tribes people in Papua New Guinea who will have these sort of federated structures. There's like a wide range of society that's historically developed visions of what decentralization means. Okay, so the decentralization aspect of Bitcoin is authentically fascinating, and in a lot of my early writings I was considering, okay, so when you're issuing tokens on this decentralized system, it bypasses the banking sector, and that has a particular political importance. Okay, now there's a second component to the original Bitcoin messaging, which is all about the monetary theory. Okay, so, and you've got to conceptually separate it, even though these two elements have been intertwined, and the actual structure of Bitcoin ends up requiring them to be intertwined. But at least conceptually, from a political perspective, they can be separated out. Okay, so the political, the monetary ideas in Bitcoin are often very conservative. Okay, now I can go into why they are conservative, but the basic point is that while the decentralization aspect is politically quite wide-ranging, its monetary aspect is very distinctly associated with right-wing economics, right? A particular brand of right-wing economics, okay? And over the years, I started to critique that monetary message a lot more. Now, there's a second bifurcation that's required here in terms of the monetary message, okay? So bear in mind that the technological decentralization aspect of Bitcoin is politically very fascinating, and I'm quite supportive of it. But the monetary message, I have a big problem with, okay? But then in that monetary message, there's these another fork you can consider, which is the reality versus the rhetoric. Okay, so a lot of my pieces where I'm writing about what Bitcoin actually is, all right, and how it's actually used, is critiquing the it's drawing attention to the discrepancy between the mythology of Bitcoin, the monetary mythology, and the actual reality. So for example, that piece I've just done about Bitcoin Countertrade is doing exactly that. Okay, it's talking about the distinction between the mythology versus the reality. Now, in the realm of the mythology, if you go down that route, you can critique the mythology itself. Okay, all right, you can critique the monetary ideology or the message that's in it. Now, one of my core claims, one of the core reasons I'm concerned about Bitcoin, for those of you who are interested in why I'm busy doing these pieces, is that when we zoom back out to those two forks in the original Bitcoin message, which was decentralization plus this conservative notion of sort of constrained fixed money, okay? The decentralization aspect is politically actually very progressive in various ways, right? And it was politically quite radical. But the monetary mythology part of it is extremely conservative. And what's happening in the world right now is a lot of people are being captured in a way by the exciting nature of the decentralization aspect. And then this conservative message is getting Trojan horsed, as it were, this conservative message comes along with it, or it rides along with this radical technological message. So in a way, what's happening, you're having all these young people who otherwise potentially would be more politically on the left or politically progressive in various ways, getting captured by the technological narrative, and in so doing, basically starting to think, if I had to put it bluntly, like old school conservatives, okay, like Margaret Thatcher, for example, okay. So you have 16-year-olds suddenly quoting Hayek and stuff like that. Now, of course, in conservative circles, this is seen as a great victory, okay. But this is where I return now to that sort of second fork in the sort of monetary side of Bitcoin. Is in reality right now, Bitcoin isn't actually challenging the existing monetary system, but what it is doing is it's spreading a particular message about money, all right? So within the existing monetary system, which we call it the fiat money system, the conservative wing of the fiat money system, or people who are conservatives within that system, are being empowered by the mythology of Bitcoin that comes Trojan horsed via that radical technological message. Now, that in broad terms is often why I end up writing about Bitcoin, because I'm concerned politically about what it's doing, okay? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm also very excited about that technological side and how it can be applied to more progressive ideas about money. So one of the other sort of big agendas I have is about how do you take the sort of radical technological element and then combine it with more progressive ideas about money. So for example, if you look at the unboxing series and the kind of stuff I've been doing in some of the DFMM videos, we're looking at, you know, how do you take some decentralized architectures and apply them to more like sort of take some older ideas but alternative currency and hybridize them. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But Bitcoin is often, at least it's highly ambiguous as to what exactly it's trying to promote in the world. Okay. So this is why I've been doing a lot of stuff about Bitcoin, but also just to like quickly share with you some of the real frustrations that one has when doing critiques and trying to do meaningful critiques about Bitcoin, is that like my intention in crafting these narratives is actually I'm trying to figure out like what you could really do with this technology. All right, what is it? What realistically, what is it, and what is its actual potential? But unfortunately, there is an industry that has a large agenda in rather spinning mythology and marketing around the tokens, and there is a vested interest often in the Bitcoin industry about demonizing people who are actually trying to like authentically look at what it is. Okay, so this is what's very, very frustrating. It's very, very hard to be somebody who is actually open to the ideas of blockchain technology, whilst also trying to advance critiques, because it's so kind of bifurcated into this type of, that the narrative basically positions you. If I do a critique of Bitcoin in the sort of, at least the sort of among all the Bitcoin intelligentsia, or the kind of people who've staked their names on promoting it, any type of critique is immediately presented as you supporting the status quo. Okay, so there's no concept that you might actually believe in the idea of challenging the status quo and yet not believe in what Bitcoin's message is. All right, it's like either the way that the debate is structured, at least internal to that community right now, is very much you're either hyper pro Bitcoin or you're pro the banks. Okay, that's what the structure is. But in reality, of course, there's so many other types of systems you can be looking at. And I've been involved in financial reform for many, many years prior to Bitcoin. So I actually have seen the many different styles. Okay. Another one of the major problems when you're doing critique around crypto is the fact that internal to the cryptocurrency community, there's all this sectarian battles that go on. Okay, so between, for example, Bitcoin and Dogecoin, or Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, and all this kind of stuff. Now, if you are outside of the cryptocurrency community, these battles make no difference. All right, they just look like the battles between, Lutherans versus Calvinists. It's all kind of like, you don't really make a distinction between them. They all look like Christians, right? For most people who are outside of crypto, this makes no difference to what the different versions of it, okay? But when you're trying to do a public critique of it, and there's all these intelligentsia around, often what the internal to the cryptocurrency community is this whole narrative around, if you support, for example, Bitcoin, you have to be against Bitcoin Cash or something like that. So often I get cast as being a person who's trying to promote some other Bitcoin-like thing by critiquing Bitcoin. Now, this is extremely frustrating because I honestly don't care about all the other types of, I have no interest in promoting a particular crypto token. But for example, a few years ago, I spoke at the Bitcoin Cash conference. Now, Bitcoin Cash is a variant of Bitcoin, okay, that sort of split off from it. But I went there and spoke about monetary theory of Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash there. And this is often now dragged up by Bitcoin proponents whenever I do a critique of Bitcoin. They try to cast me as being somebody who's trying to like some salesman for like the Bitcoin Cash community or something. Because, and the reason why this has sort of validity internal to the crypto world is that this is often what's a lot of the sort of battles are people trying to like promote different coins to sell, right? So they often think that anybody who's doing a critique is trying to do that as well. So this is extremely frustrating, having to try and like show that what you're interested in doing is actually critiquing all the sort of the entire sort of paradigm, as it were. And the other like major frustration that you're going to have if you ever try to do this type of work about critiquing or sort of being more nuanced about things like Bitcoin, is that often a critique of the ideology or the mythology gets you cast as being denying the usefulness of the thing. Now, so for example, I can clearly see the uses that Bitcoin has, and one of the reasons why I can see that is I try to do actual analyses of what it is. Okay, so I can say, here is this thing that's very useful, for example, for countertrade. That's one of my big arguments. Bitcoin's highly countertradable, right? So that's what some of my pieces have been about. Now, if you say that, what's happening is I'm going against the official mythology of Bitcoin, which is that it's a monetary system. Okay. Now, as soon as you counter that narrative, you get cast as being somebody who denies that this thing has any use. Okay. I'm trying to think of a metaphor. It's a bit like seeing a spade, but imagine there's like a community that characterizes a spade as a fork. Okay, like a gardening fork or something, but actually it's a spade. And so you say, well, I'm going to describe what it is. It's a spade, okay? And then the sort of community that has this interest in promoting it as a fork will then use that to say that you don't believe it has any use. But of course, spades are very useful things, right? So similarly, I am often talking about the uses that Bitcoin has, but within the sort of official Bitcoin Intelligentsia, that then gets recast as an attack on the usefulness of the system. Okay, so it's an extremely frustrating thing to try to do any form of critique around this, because there's such huge interests people have, and so many people have staked their reputations on having a very particular perspective on Bitcoin. Okay, so I thought what I'd maybe quickly try to do in the second section of this is to sort of go into some of the major arguments I've been making around Bitcoin, and to just sort of like maybe also look ahead to what some of the sort of big pieces I might do in future about it, because I'm kind of putting together a sort of series of modular components that could become useful to help you navigate the crypto scene. All right, so let's go into that now, starting with this piece I've just done called iToken. Okay, so let me talk about this iToken piece that I've just done. Now, the piece is like 7,500 words long, so it's a big piece. It's a big essay. All right, it's going to take quite a significant amount of time to read, and quite a few people who've been reading it are a little bit like confused, and it's a heavy piece, let's put it that way. All right. Now, over time, I'm going to try and work on nuancing that essay out and making a simpler version of it. But let me try to convey some of the intuitions behind what I'm doing in that essay. Okay. So you might have noticed I've been doing this series on structure and function of money. All right, I did a piece about how the functions of money paradigm confuses lots of people, or else perhaps distracts them from seeing the monetary system. Okay, now this line of work that I've been doing about the structure of money versus the functions of money actually has a bearing on my work on Bitcoin. So actually some of the stuff, my analysis on Bitcoin is drawing on this stuff about people's more generalized inability to see the structures of money. Okay. Now, just to put this in context, if you think about what the original newsletter of Altered States of Monetary Consciousness is trying to do, it sort of starts from the assumption that we are immersed in a huge network structure that is very hard to see. So picture, for example, a fish swimming in water. It's actually very hard for a fish to see water precisely because it's so immersive. Okay, what a fish can do is pick out sort of anomalies in that space, but seeing the actual water is very, very hard. Now, using that as a metaphor, quite a similar thing happens with the monetary system. All right, it is a network structure with various components to it, various elements to it, which totally immerses us and actually underpins modern capitalism. Okay, and it's extremely hard to think outside of it, or to even see it for that matter. Okay, now those are sort of starting assumptions I have, and then one of these sort of follow-on assumptions that comes from that, or sort of points that comes from that, is that actually what people do see in the monetary system are the surface level artifacts, or the surface artifacts. So for example, units of cash that move around, all right, or else credit cards, or else the numbers you'll see in your bank account. All right, so in the public, if you take a person who hasn't had any real training around monetary systems, they'll have a series of various data to draw upon, right? They will have seen that money does certain things, all right, but they'll then have these certain visual imagery of it as sort of like these notes or as these numbers and accounts, all right? But very little strong understanding of what the actual structure of the monetary system is, okay? Now, this is not universally true, but it's very, very true in general. There's a very poor understanding of monetary systems generally in society, okay? Now, this is a point about monetary understanding more generally, all right? But this is going to play into how Bitcoin is perceived more specifically, okay? But before I go into that, the critiques I've been making about the functions of money paradigm relates to this, okay? Because when you're stuck in a huge sort of network structure and you can't see it, but you can see these surface level artifacts, you can shallowly speak about what those artifacts can do. All right. Oh, I can use money to exchange. Okay. So you can talk about the functions of these types of these things, right? But without necessarily understanding how those things achieve the functions that you see. Okay. Now, one of my critiques of the functions of money paradigm is that it makes no attempt to describe how money does what it does. It just says money is anything that fulfills these certain functions. Money is just a medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account, all right, which doesn't describe anything about how it does that, all right? So if you read my pieces about the structure of money versus the functions of money, this is the critique I'm making. And part of the politics of this critique is that actually if you want to come to a strong and intuitive understanding of how money does these things, you must focus on building a structural description of the monetary system. Now, one of the part of the political dynamics of this is that historically the economics discipline didn't really ever do this, all right? And actually there's an argument to be said that there's a kind of capitalist mythology that the economics discipline perpetuates by refusing to actually name the structure of money. So you could imagine a type of priesthood that refuses to actually like describe what the system is, but describes stuff that it does, okay? And so a lot of the sort of public delusions of money are sort of echoed in a certain narrative that comes out of economics. And there's people who critique this beyond myself. I mean, I'm not the only person who makes this critique. Okay, now one of the sort of key ways this then links to Bitcoin is that one of the reasons why Bitcoin has been very successful is it actually has exploited a lot of the same weaknesses that people have already in how they perceive the monetary system. Okay, now one of the sort of dark elements of this, and this is quite a hard argument to make, but see if you can follow me here. So if you start from the assumption that the way people are taught about money and the way that they are asked to think about it actually serves to distract from describing what it actually is, all right? And then you see that the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin sort of promotion often draws upon that same mythology. You can start to make an argument that actually the Bitcoin system is very useful for perpetuating the existing ideology of money that is useful to the existing power structure or power plays within the monetary system. Okay, now this narrative, which I'll try to convey more in a sort of more subtle, more sophisticated way later, is very, very controversial because the entire Bitcoin community relies upon a narrative which says it is the antithesis of our monetary system. Okay, that it is a kind of revolutionary movement trying to reform the monetary system, right? And yet it uses much of the same mythology that's required to protect the current players in our monetary system. Okay, so this is what's for actual monetary reformers, this is very difficult to deal with. Okay, so this is part of the sort of background framing of this piece I token. Now, one of the things you want to do if you're analyzing a monetary system and you want to connect together the structure to the function, you got to provide this description of how it does the things it does. Okay. Now, for example, you can actually do this with things like gold. You can come for a description. You can say, this is what gold is. This is its actual chemical structure and so on. This is what it looks like. This is how it's culturally been embedded into different communities and so on. And this is eventually how it has certain money-like properties. Okay, now look, you work from the structure of it, as it were, out through these sort of cultural layers to eventually describing how it does certain things in society. Okay, similarly with our existing fiat money system. Now, in the iToken piece, I provided a very short structural description of the monetary system from which you can then say, this is how the monetary system does certain things. Now, one of the deeply problematic things in Bitcoin is that structural description has never been provided, all right? It's simply the starting position of many people in Bitcoin is to simply assert that it is a monetary system and then to show examples of it moving around and being used for exchange, but without ever describing how it does that. Okay, so the iToken piece is trying to describe the inner essence of what those tokens are, such that we can come to a description of how they do certain things. Okay. Now, one of the ways to kind of, well, perhaps one of the ways to illustrate this is to use a sort of slightly simpler example, right? Like, let's take the example of this cup here. Okay, this is a very simple object in society. Now, a functional description of this cup could be something like thing to hold liquid, okay? And yet this here also holds liquid, all right? And you wouldn't describe it as a cup, right? But like these functional descriptions are problematic precisely because they allow so many different things to, there's so many different things that fulfill similar functions, okay? Now, like for example, my wash basin over there also holds liquid, okay? So when you're trying to do a description of a system, what you want to do is you want to start with describing like how it was made, what it actually is, after which you can then describe how it does certain things, okay? So for example, with this cup, I could say this cup was made by some guy using a particular material, it's fashioned in this particular shape, and so on. And what you end up with is this type of structure with a hollowed out middle, but with a bottom that prevents the liquid falling out. And this is what creates a vessel that in turn enables you to hold water in it. Okay, that's how you can move from a structural description into a kind of functional description. Okay, now this is obviously a very simple object, but with monetary systems you can do a similar type of thing. All right, so a lot of sort of more sophisticated traditions in money, starting with sort of anthropology of money through to sort of chartalist theory and so on. There's many different versions of this. But sort of to start with a description of the structure that then in turn enables exchange, for example. Now, the economist approach that I was critiquing starts from the functions and then doesn't really ever talk about the structure, all right? Now, Bitcoin is doing a similar thing, all right? If you look at the earlier language of Bitcoin, if you sort of go back to the very, very opening parts of that community and you see the original Bitcoin white paper issued by Satoshi Nakamoto, what it is, it's a description of how you can issue certain types of tokens, all right? And there's nothing about the act of issuing tokens that suggests you're creating a monetary system. I mean, anybody can issue tokens. There's nothing about tokens that implies that they have to be money, all right? But what has happened is that there's a linguistic overlay that's been put in the original Bitcoin community. If you look at the subtitle of the Satoshi white paper on Bitcoin, it basically just says Bitcoin, with the word coin, of course, which is like a monetary term, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So from the very beginning, it was simply named money, all right? And then a certain structure was presented. And largely because people already have such a weak understanding of monetary systems, this was largely unquestioned. So people would see these numbered objects coming out of the system and they'd say, well, it seems money-like, right? You can move them around. And from that, and there's already this linguistic overlay which calls them coins and cash and money. And so we're just going to go along with it, right? Now, a large part of what I'm doing in iToken is critiquing that and saying, okay, now what you actually have to do if you want to analyze Bitcoin tokens is totally forget about that linguistic overlay and go straight into analyzing what exactly those tokens are. All right, what are those tokens? All right, how do those tokens achieve the functions that you then attribute to them? All right, give me an account for how they do what they do. Okay, now that's what the sort of agenda of the piece is. Now, what's very controversial about what I have asserted there is precisely that, well, I've actually asserted something very, very simple. All right. And what I've asserted is that the tokens in Bitcoins are just numbers. Okay. I've asserted that they are a limited edition numerical nouns. Now, that's probably something that will take a little bit a while to sort of to grasp. But if you imagine yourself as an alien coming from outer space, all right, and you've flown down to Earth, and you're not aware of any of the marketing around Bitcoin, and you're just looking at what it does, all right, you can come to quite a simple description. You can say is a sort of a system of interconnected participants with a rule set, okay, that enables people to write out numbers after exerting energy. Okay, after which the numbers can be reassigned between people, or you can perform operations upon the numbers. Okay, and this is actually very easy to see in the Bitcoin system. All right, if you go onto any block explorer where you're analyzing the sort of transactions going through the system, you'll always see that every new block in Bitcoin begins with what they call newly minted coins, or newly created coins, which is literally where one of the miners in the system has just written out numbers into the system. Okay, so the point of iToken's piece is actually very, very simple. It's saying what Bitcoin is doing is it's created a system whereby you can write out numbers after exerting energy. Okay, now the analysis then that follows is, well, what are those numbers? What exactly do they point to, if anything? Okay, now this is where an understanding of the existing monetary system becomes very important, because if you're analyzing the existing monetary system and you see numbers in the existing monetary system, you can ask yourself similarly, what are those numbers? Are they the same as the numbers you see in Bitcoin? Okay, so part of the argument I'm making in the iToken piece is that the numbers in the normal monetary system are actually accounting records, all right, granting you access to something beyond themselves. Okay, now this is quite a hard argument to convey, but if you look at any accounting statement, if you go into any sort of like balance sheet or any type of accounting statement and you look at the numbers, you'll always realize that they pertain to something beyond themselves, all right? You're accounting for something, okay? You're not merely writing numbers, okay? So all accounting statements in the world, I'm arguing are the numbers that you find in those accounting statements are numerical adjectives, okay? They point to something beyond themselves, whereas in the Bitcoin system, the numbers actually don't point to anything beyond themselves. They're numerical nouns. Okay, now numerical nouns is a concept you get in mathematics, all right, where numbers are seen as agents in themselves, all right. Now, so this is the sort of, in a way, the most controversial element of my argument in iToken is to say that, well, what the system is doing is people are just literally writing out mathematical objects, which can subsequently be manipulated, all right? But the key thing is that they have to exert energy before they're allowed to write those numbers out, and then they can write them out within a system that places limits on how many can be written out, okay? And the whole sort of psychology of Bitcoin then is, well, this is the sort of underlying reality of the system. But then there's a secondary system, a secondary marketing system that places a kind of linguistic layer or a kind of mythological layer over what those numbers actually are. Okay. Now, I don't know if I very effectively conveyed that concept. It takes like quite a few times to, it's worth like going through that piece and assessing it for yourself. But just to reiterate, my core claim is that Bitcoin tokens are essentially limited edition numbers, okay, printed within a system that requires energy that to be expended before you're allowed to write them out. Now, the key question that then emerges if you're actually a sort of a monetary designer is like, is it possible to turn that into a monetary system? Okay, like it's very, very interesting. It's certainly a system where you can create these sort of mathematical objects that move around, but is that the same thing as a monetary system? And part of my argument is no, that's not the same thing as a monetary system. It's mimicking the surface experience of a monetary system, okay? Which relates back to this point I was making earlier, which people have a pre-existing weakness for seeing money simply as movable numbered objects, okay? And not looking at the actual structure of what makes those movable numbered objects work. Now, one of the most fascinating things in Bitcoin is what it tries to do, or what at least the mythology tries to do, is it tries to associate itself with commodity money. It tries to associate itself with gold. And what's really problematic about this is that actually the imagery that it uses or sort of is actually more like bank account imagery. Okay, so if you think about what is the surface level experience of a normal unit of fiat money, well, actually it's numbers in an account. Okay, if you look at your sort of bank deposits, they are numbers in an account. You see these sort of like movable numbered objects going around. All right. If you think about something like gold, by contrast, like the surface experience is very, very different. You have physical, tangible objects with a certain level of beauty. Okay. So actually, technically speaking, Bitcoin's imagery is much closer to the bank account imagery than it is to gold imagery. But in bank accounts, though, you can actually give a structural description for what those numbers are. It pertains to IOUs issued out by the banking system that can be moved around. Right? Bitcoin doesn't have any account for what the numbers are, but what it does have is a certain type of marketing apparatus that then sort of sticks a certain type of metallic imagery around the numbers. Okay, so if you ever look at all the sort of visual imagery around Bitcoin, it's largely about sort of trying to make you believe that the numbers are somewhat like metal or something like that. There's actually a very good anthropologist called Bill Maurer who's written a lot about this digital metalism, all right? This attempt to create this sort of metallic imagery around numbers, okay? Now that's like really fascinating, because if you had to go back, for example, into the medieval times and try to show somebody a number and say, this is much like gold, they would definitely reject this type of a statement, okay? But nowadays there's a certain marketing apparatus which is working to try and create this imagery. One of the potentially most damaging implications of this type of analysis is that fiat money and gold are actually more similar to each other than they are than Bitcoin is to either of them. Okay, but Bitcoin keeps on trying to associate itself to the gold system to contrast itself to the fiat system. All right, but actually, it's possible that there is more in common with the gold system and fiat system than gold has with Bitcoin. So once you do an analysis of like what are Bitcoin tokens actually, okay, you can then look at how they are presented to the public. Okay, so the discrepancy between what they are and how they are presented. Now, how they are presented, as I mentioned, is that they are presented as being a sort of commodity type money in digital form. All right, and part of the whole sort of psychological structure that's required to make this argument is to point to the amount of energy that's required before the tokens can be created or the numbers can be written out, as it were. Okay, and one of the thought experiments I posed in the iToken piece, and I got my uncle to do an illustration for it as well, is to ask yourself, if you found numbers on the top of Mount Everest, would they still just be numbers, or would the fact that somebody has exerted all this energy getting up the mountain before they write out the numbers make any difference? Okay, because a large part of the Bitcoin messaging is the fact that all this energy is required before the numbers can be written out, and that somehow that makes them into a commodity. All right, and yet to a person who encounters a number, there is nothing about a number that you could encounter a number that took almost no energy to write out, and a number that took a large amount of energy to write out, and you wouldn't notice the difference. To you, they could be exactly the same thing. You could see 50 and 50. And there's no way that you could make a distinction between them. You wouldn't know about all the energy that's gone in the background. Okay, so at an experiential level, it's very hard to make a claim that anybody can experience the energy that's been put into writing out the numbers in Bitcoin. And yet the Bitcoin messaging very, very heavily relies upon this narrative that somehow the energy makes a difference to what these numbers are, you know, alongside the branding and visual imagery that they sort of paste around them. Okay, and then this the marketing apparatus is very much drawing on that commodity imagery alongside a kind of conservative critique of fiat money systems. Now this goes back to the monetary mythology element of Bitcoin I talked about earlier. So remember that there's these two conceptually separate forks in the system, or two conceptually separate parts. There's the actual technological decentralization, and then there's a certain conservative monetary story, all right, where it's talked about the fact that we can create and destroy money very easily in the fiat money system is a injustice. Now, historically, that argument is associated with monetary conservatives who believe money should be constrained. Okay, now, just to quick note on this mythology in conservative thought is that even prior to Bitcoin, the monetary, or so let's say the commodity money imagination, this idea that money should be some kind of constrained commodity, that was always almost like a Platonic ideal that's never actually achieved. There's very, very few actual conservatives who truly believe, for example, that gold should be a monetary system. Okay, almost no actual conservative would say like, oh, we really believe that gold should be the monetary system. And yet, gold is a very, very useful ideological device in conservatism to hold up as a type of like Platonic ideal of what money should be, even if you're never going to use it. Okay, so it serves as this almost this kind of like symbolic role, as it were, as a kind of like morality play about what money should be. So this is very important because in actual conservatives are very, very happy to use the normal fiat money system and actually often preside over it in the banking sector, all right? And yet will rely upon this commodity imagery of money to convey certain messages about the monetary system, about the fact that it should be constrained and it should aspire to be commodity-like. Okay, now Bitcoin very, very heavily is drawing upon this conservative ideology of money, trying to signal that it is not expandable in the same way that fiat money is, or for that matter, contractible. Okay. So this is what the whole sort of marketing apparatus of Bitcoin is doing. It's sort of drawing on this sort of old school conservative commodity money imagery of a sort of like a Platonic ideal of money, as it were. Okay, and that was the sort of the original marketing of Bitcoin, was about the fact that it would form this alternative, right? But of course, one of the most complex things you've got to deal with if you're actually trying to analyze the system now is that there's another bifurcation. Okay, let me try and sketch this out visually, because this gets very like trippy if you're trying to like grapple with it. So let's go to our first bifurcation in Bitcoin. All right, the bifurcation between the technological decentralization element and the conservative monetary story. All right, those are two conceptually separate parts of the system, right? And don't necessarily have to be together, but have found themselves together. Okay. Now, if we zoom in on the sort of conservative monetary story, you can look at the distinction, as I mentioned earlier, between the reality of Bitcoin versus the sort of mythology of it. Okay. And then there's a sort of further fork that pertains to both of those, which is the distinction that's actually developed internal to the Bitcoin community between Bitcoin as money versus Bitcoin as an investment. Okay, so there's actually an internal tension that exists in the Bitcoin community where people try to simultaneously speak about it as a monetary system, so going along with that monetary mythology, whilst simultaneously also speaking about it as not being money, but being something that you buy for money in order to resell for more money. That's the investment language in Bitcoin. Now, these are all always getting tangled up in each other. And one of the reasons why they're getting tangled up is that actually to market Bitcoin as an investment, right, you have to present it as money, right? Because it has nothing else to commend itself to an investor. All right. Now, this gets very, very trippy, but it's also extremely damaging to public debate right now because I actually did this piece for CoinDesk, which was called How to Win a Bitcoin Street Fight. CoinDesk is a big sort of crypto publication, and I was talking about this problem in the Bitcoin community where people will simultaneously use monetary language with investment language. Okay. And you actually can't use these two forms of language simultaneously. You have to pick one or the other. And the reason why I called it How to Win a Bitcoin Street Fight was I was drawing on imagery of the sort of two classic old arcade games, Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. And I put this imagery out of saying, imagine walking into an arcade and finding yourself faced by Street Fighter on the one hand and Mortal Kombat on the other hand. And both of them are on separate arcade consoles, okay? Now, you can go and choose either one of them, but once you choose one of them, you have to stay within that game world. And there's different players you can play and you can fight and so on, right? Now, in the original Bitcoin world, the story was that it was a battling the fiat money system. All right, and that, let's say in that game world, what Bitcoin's role was to like attack the dollar system, right? But then now there's like a separate game world that's developed, or a separate console, as it were, in which Bitcoin's actually battling other assets on a market rather than the monetary system. Okay, so in my metaphor that I was developing for CoinDesk, I was saying. That's fine to actually debate in any one of those. You can analyze Bitcoin as a monetary system if you wish, all right? Or you can analyze it as an investment priced within the monetary system, but you can't simultaneously do both because that would be almost like trying to use a character from Mortal Kombat to fight a character in Street Fighter across the consoles, all right? Which is actually sort of from a sort of paradigmatic perspective isn't actually possible. All right, it's like sort of analyzing two different sports simultaneously using sort of conflicting rule sets. So this is the sort of like all the sort of topsy-turvy kind of language in crypto partly relates to the fact that they've blended together monetary language with investment language. Okay. Which is partially why there's all these sort of delusions that are constantly sort of gestating in that scene. Now, having made that critique about all sort of the distinctions between like the reality of Bitcoin as this thing that people buy for money and resell for money, and its sort of mythology, and the fact they're all getting mixed up, once you get past that critique, you can start to say interesting things about it. You can say, okay, well, look, what's happened is that these limited edition numbers, which you call tokens, have come to have a price. All right. Now, once something has a price, it can actually be used in the case of Bitcoin, you can use it to form a type of exchange. Okay. So this is where my analysis of Countertrade comes in. So if you see me using this word Countertrade, it refers to a very, very simple point. Okay. It's that it is entirely possible to swap priced objects. Okay, now you check out the piece that I did about that, but I can try to give you some very simple examples of how Countertrade works, because Countertrade is at the heart of Bitcoin's sort of moneyness, as it were. Okay, so imagine, for example, two two friends walk into a shop. All right. Now they both buy a jacket in that shop. Okay. One jacket costs $50 and another jacket costs $50. Okay. So both of them cost the same amount. All right. So that each friend buys a jacket. They walk back home. All right. And they get back home and they're like checking out each other's jackets, and they suddenly realize that actually each one prefers the other person's jacket. And they just say, well, what we could, I mean, if you think about the options that they have here, one option is for them to both go back to the shop, ask for a refund, and then use the money to buy each other's jackets back from the shop. All right. But that's kind of like a ridiculous thing to do. What's far easier to do is just to swap the jackets, okay? To say, well, this one costs 50 and this one costs 50, so let's just swap them, all right? Now, if you're looking at that interaction from the outside, you would see one person handing over a jacket and another jacket moving that way, okay? Now, you could say, oh, you paid for this jacket with this jacket, okay? That, at a superficial level, it looks like you're doing some kind of like barter with the objects. Okay, but what's actually happening is you're taking two monetary prices and you're sort of superimposing them over each other to work out an exchange ratio between non-monetary objects. Okay, this happens a lot in world trade. It's a massive part of all sorts of business operations is countertrade. Okay, where you use the monetary price of things to decide upon the exchange ratios between things. Okay. Now, one of the core concepts you need to grapple with in order to be able to understand countertrade properly and to not be tripped up by a lot of the crypto sort of topsy-turvy narrative is you got to see a monetary system as being the center around which all other objects circulate. So the imagery I actually used in the iToken piece was to talk about a tornado. All right, so imagine a kind of like some kind of vortex, all right, around which everything else is spinning. Okay, now imagine there's objects spinning around it. Okay, and this imagery is useful because it makes a very clear structural distinction between a kind of like vortex structure and then everything else that's sort of priced around it. So this is, if I'm thinking about monetary systems, when you are within a particular monetary system, everything's routing through it, okay? And you can't speak of that monetary system as routing through the things themselves, okay? So the example I used in the iToken piece was to say, you can't speak about a tornado being sucked in by the debris that's flying around it, okay? It's the debris that's being sucked in, okay? Not the tornado. So with monetary systems, it's very similar, right? The pricing vortexes within, say, for example, the US dollar system, there's all these things that are routing through the US dollar system, okay? Now, the tornado imagery is not perfect, but it sort of crudely and quite effectively illustrates this distinction between the sort of monetary pricing vortex and then everything that's within that system, okay? So if you're looking at something like Countertrade, you can see there are two objects in the monetary pricing vortex, okay? Actually, they both have a price, and actually you can swap them with each other, all right? And thereby do some kind of exchange, okay? And that's what's called countertrade, right? I don't have to use money within a monetary system to do exchange, basically. I can use some other object that's priced in money and swap it with something else to do exchange, okay? Now, in the Bitcoin system, this is what's happening. The Bitcoin tokens have a price in the monetary vortex, and the fact that they have a price is what enables them to be then swapped with other things that have prices. Now, I know this very, very clearly because when I used to exchange my book for Bitcoin, I would engage in countertrade. What I'd first do is I'd work out the monetary price of the book. I'd then look at the monetary price of Bitcoin, and then you use the exchange ratio implied by the two monetary prices. Okay, now that's basically taking two objects in a monetary system and swapping them with each other. Now that's obviously very, very different to those objects somehow being the monetary system. Okay. Now, one of the key arguments I'm making about Bitcoin, though, is so obviously, I make this argument about Countertrade, and it gets attacked because people hate this idea that Bitcoin isn't actually the monetary system. All right. But structurally, this is true. All right. Nothing is priced in Bitcoin, and it totally depends upon its current dollar price in order to be able to have this exchangeability that then gives it a money-like feeling. All right. So what I'm arguing often is that actually Bitcoin has very high counter tradability precisely because it's highly movable and it's digital. Okay. So for example, this cup here has a price, but it's very, very hard to counter trade this because, if I'm trying to like get something from somebody else, I can like physically transport this cup to them, or I could try to send it in the post, but it's very, very hard to move this around. So it's not very easy to counter trade this object. But if you have a digital object with a price, it's actually very easy to counter trade. So one of I think one of the most fascinating areas if you're analyzing Bitcoin is to ask yourself, like, are we going to see a new age of counter trade? All right, a new age of some kind of these non-monetary objects being swapped in a sort of money-like way. Now that's an authentically fascinating question, and it has very interesting political implications, right? And also potentially very empowering implications. Okay, so I actually think when you analyze Bitcoin as a counter-trade object, it suddenly becomes quite fascinating and almost quite progressive. And this is a lot of the arguments about how, for example, people living under authoritarian regimes can use this object to do forms of exchange. All of that can be analyzed under this counter trade paradigm. Okay. All right. So part of my frustration, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video about people when I made that point about calling a spade, and then people who want to present the spade as a fork, then accusing you of denying the usefulness of this thing, comes from this is kind of what I'm describing here. Like, Bitcoin counter trade is very, very interesting and potentially quite useful, but it's very, very important to note that a counter trade object isn't necessarily displacing the monetary system. Okay, it relies upon getting a price in the monetary system before it has counter tradability. Okay. Now you might say, well, experientially that is not that different to moving money around and so on. And why do you care? Well, to go back to what I was saying earlier, the reason I care is the ideological impact that Bitcoin is having. Okay. So in reality, what it is a sort of limited edition, like, numerical object that has come to have a price that can then be swapped. All right. But the way it's described is very, very different. It's described as being this thing that's going to bring down the monetary system and so on. But so for a start, the problem about that narrative is that it overshadows many other initiatives that are actually doing potentially more meaningful work and actually trying to reform the monetary system. But secondly, it relies upon this whole conservative ideology about how money should be. Okay, so when you analyze Bitcoin or present Bitcoin as money, it has to come with this conservative ideology, which is very, very concerning. Okay, now one of the sort of projects I've got going is like, okay, to form some kind of, and I'll probably be doing a future piece about this, is like how to sort of decode the language around Bitcoin in the public domain versus its reality. So almost like a translation sheet. I sort of did this a little bit in the iToken piece. I was saying, when somebody talks about Bitcoin's having an exchange rate with the dollar, you're just talking about its price. Okay. Now, I will actually also be doing a piece showing or analyzing the distinction between a foreign exchange market and counter trade objects. Okay. So a large part of the sort of Bitcoin sort of mythology right now is partly predicated upon it being presented as being part of the foreign exchange market. Interestingly, if you go onto like these currency exchange or sort of currency sites where they're sort of giving the sort of exchange rates between different currencies, things like Bitcoin are now listed on those sites as if they were part of the foreign exchange market, which of course is a massive win for the Bitcoin community, but it's a false presentation of Bitcoin as being part of the FX market. Now, one of the ways you analyze this is it's just like if you return to that point I made earlier about if you seeing monetary systems as like vortexes, okay, and so the core and everything in that circling around it, okay. Now these vortexes are not impermeable, all right, but they do reign supreme in particular areas, okay. So if, for example, if I'm right now in Berlin, if I walk outside and I go into the street there and I do a survey of people, I say, what money are you currently carrying with you? Most of them will say we're carrying euros. And if I ask them, what do you intend to do with those euros? Most of them will say, well, I intend to buy something in the shop with them. Okay. So let's say I do a survey of 1,000 people. Probably at least 900 of them are going to say something like, I intend to use it to buy something, okay? Now, what's happening here in Berlin here, we are within the euro pricing vortex, all right? We're immersed within it, and people conceive of these monetary tokens that they're moving around as being things that enables them to get access to real goods and services. Now, on the outskirts of this network, okay, if you're imagining this as a network, on the sort of peripheries of it, there is a part where it touches other currency networks, okay, the US dollar system, the Japanese yen system. Now, on these peripheral outskirts is where the FX market is. It's the zone of swapping between different currencies. Now, one of the reasons, one of the most important things is that actually the role of FX market traders is a very, very niche and specialized role, and a comparatively small amount of society does it. So if I go out and do the survey of the road outside my apartment here, and I go and ask 1,000 people, it is hypothetically possible that there will be, let's say, 50 of them who sort of engage in some kind of FX trading on the side occasionally, all right? So they might say, well, I intend to exchange this euro for dollars and then rebuy euros again, right? But it's going to be a very, very niche and small part of the overall network, okay? By far, the majority of people in that network are going to be thinking about using these units to get real goods and services, okay? Now, if you go into the Bitcoin system, this is inverted, okay? You have the inverse situation. The vast majority of people who are holding these digital objects in Bitcoin, or what I refer to as, limited edition numbers, perceive, when you ask them, what are you going to do with those? Most of them perceive themselves that they're going to sell it for money at some point, okay? So the vast majority of the Bitcoin community imagines themselves or thinks about these objects in terms of US dollars and euros, for example. Now, this is very, very different to the psychology of an actual monetary system where only a small percentage of the society perceives the units in terms of what they could be sold for in terms of other currencies, okay? So, but what Bitcoin's doing is exploiting that type of ambiguity that it has, and the fact that it has this sort of like money-like surface experience, plus the fact that it has this counter-trade ability to present itself as if it was part of the foreign exchange market rather than being, like something you'd find at a supermarket. Technically speaking, it is actually more like something you would find in a supermarket, but it is far more counter-tradable than most things you'd find in a supermarket. Hence, this weird sort of ambiguity that it has, okay? One of the points I was also making in the iToken piece is to correctly identify what the attack happening in Bitcoin is. All right, so, and I use this example of GameStop shares, okay? So when you're thinking about monetary systems as being these vortexes around which all these other things are being priced and traded, you start to see that the act of choosing one of those things over another thing affects its price, okay? So I made this statement, which is this idea that it is the promoters of GameStop shares that lose out when people decide to use their dollars to buy Bitcoin instead, all right? Rather than the dollar system that loses out, all right? So if we take this imagery of a kind of like monetary vortex and these different objects flying around it, like GameStop shares is one object and Bitcoin tokens are another object, all right? And when you choose to spend your money on something like Bitcoin, what you are also implicitly doing is choosing to not spend it on GameStop. Okay, so it is these promoters that lose out. And this is at the core of what is often, about pricing systems and monetary systems. This is what Adam Smith used to talk about in terms of like the invisible hand of a market, right? There's this routing system that the monetary system creates. And then your choice to route money to particular things is affecting other things because you're not choosing them. Okay, so and the key trick is to see what's actually being affected, because, for example, if I choose to buy Tesla cars rather than choosing to buy, for example, I don't know, packaged holidays to sort of some fancy ski resort or something, what implicitly is going to happen in the monetary system is that the price of Tesla cars is going to have this ability to move up, whilst the price of the holidays will go down. But the actual monetary system that they're routing through won't really be affected by either of those things. Okay, the foreign exchange markets do affect the sort of there is a way that currencies get affected by the movements between the different currency networks, but internal to it, those sort of objects are not necessarily affecting the monetary system. So similarly with Bitcoin, the act of buying it is often presented in the sort of crypto world as being the act of attacking the dollar, but really what you're often doing is attacking other investment assets that you otherwise might have bought, such as shares. Okay. So that's like one other point to add to the sort of reality of Bitcoin versus the marketing pitch or the sort of way it's presented in the public. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why, let me try to put it like a slightly, well, potentially positive, but also simultaneously negative spin on these kind of delusions that are going on. Now, I come from an anthropology background. And in anthropology, there's quite an interesting little niche field where people study carnivals. Now, if you think about anthropologists, they would be going into these sort of communities which often have particular social structures. But every now and again, there'll be this break from the social structure. So like a few days where they all kind of can go crazy and do something, where they have this big festival and men dress up as women and sort of poor people dress up as kings and so on, right? Now, in the study of carnivals, it's often assumed that what's going on in carnivals is that there is some kind of social function, with some kind of social like release of tension that happens with carnivals. You can probably analyze like sporting matches with a similar kind of thing. People are kind of like venting out a bunch of stuff through this type of sort of spectacles. Now, there's quite a strong argument to say this is happening in the Bitcoin world, that a lot of people authentically are filled with angst about the existing economic system, feel a sense of futility and inability to change it, all right, and then also feel highly precarious or sort of susceptible to ideas that they should be like getting wealthier than they actually are, right? Now, if you look at like Bitcoin, it sort of taps into a lot of these, it ticks a lot of these boxes. Okay, what it does is it enables many people to believe that they're engaging in a kind of economic revolution, all right, against the sort of status quo, whilst simultaneously getting like wealthy potentially according to the normal rules of the system, all right? And so it has this like really interesting sort of structure where like you can kind of like engage in this sort of fantasy of revolution whilst simultaneously like implicitly buying into the principles of the thing you're supposedly rebelling against. Now, that's easy to mock, but actually it's probably quite powerful, and it's probably something that people really do need. So if you look at the almost religious type of zeal that people have around Bitcoin, it very, very clearly feels like something people are trying to like grapple onto and like believe in, right? Now, this really backfires on me heavily because whenever I try to do actual analysis of Bitcoin, I get a lot of these converts, people who desperately want to believe the story, who will like attack you like crazy because you're basically attacking their sort of belief system and their sort of what they're holding on to, even though it's very, very easy to point out all the contradictions of the system. Much like it's quite easy to point out contradictions in certain religious beliefs. You can point out many contradictions in the Bitcoin system, but in doing so, you of course suddenly find yourself the object of attack. So I always have like an interesting response in a way. Like part of me gets like, when I'm being attacked by all the sort of crypto converts, obviously it's very like antagonizing and can be quite upsetting. But I also feel a certain degree of like maybe like empathy or a certain degree of understanding about why they want to believe the narrative. All right. But of course, it's extremely frustrating because there's, in the process of them wanting to believe this narrative, this is how this very conservative monetary story is being perpetuated. Now, this is partly where probably the conclusion of what I'm going to say about this, and one of the most destructive elements of the system right now, is that this carnivalesque element, which is capturing all sorts of people's imaginations, all right, either because they want to get rich quick or because they believe in the actual vision. What it's doing is it's, I call it this Trojan horse effect. It's capturing people's sense of idealism and their sense of some like wanting some kind of rebellion, but then pushing something which is extremely conservative and regressive, actually like highly, definitely what you wouldn't associate with rebellion. It's using that excitement to push this extremely conservative monetary story. Now, I actually was doing a certain type of, I want to put a piece out about this like in due course, but I was analyzing this a few months ago in terms of the Matrix. So, you know, in the Matrix, I don't know how many of you have watched the Matrix, but in the Matrix, there's this whole thing about like, okay, you're immersed in some system, right? And then this guy comes along, right? And he's like, I offer you this way to exit the system, right? You know, like break free and see the world as it actually is. Okay, and in the Matrix, Neo does this, and he sort of breaks free of the Matrix, and he suddenly sees the world for what it is. Okay, now that's a sort of core plot device or plot line in the Matrix. But now let's imagine an alternative scenario in the first Matrix film, at least, where actually the system itself generates the fantasy of the Morpheus figure. So in the original Matrix, Morpheus is the one who offers Neo the ability to escape from the Matrix, right? Now, and he's like a liberation figure. But imagine there was something internal to the Matrix which generated a sort of Morpheus figure to create the internal illusion of an escape from the Matrix, right? Now, I often get this feeling when I'm looking at the Bitcoin system. I often get the feeling that actually what's going on here, this is a very controversial belief, but certainly at the ideological level, what's happening here is that the actual capitalist monetary system, which is underpinned by the state and the banking sector, has generated all these internal tensions internal to it. And something like Bitcoin actually offers this very, very useful way to sort of release some of those tensions without ever actually challenging the monetary system, all right? And actually while strengthening some of the most conservative elements of that system, okay? So I sort of see it almost like a sort of internally generated fantasy within the real monetary system, which is pushing all sorts of idealistic people into believing that they're engaging in some kind of revolution against the monetary system, when in reality they're not, all right? And this is potentially the most sort of frightening element of the Bitcoin system for people like me who've spent a long time trying to like look at alternative economies and how you try to, you know, improve economies, or how you try to build authentically like people-powered alternatives to sort of like corporate capitalism. And you suddenly see all these people who have come to believe that sort of buying these like sort of numbered objects will somehow enable them to escape. Okay, now this is like a seriously real problem, because I, even in my own anecdotal experience, have come across so many people who have come to believe this. So for example, members of my family all sorts of friends of mine who previously were never involved in any type of sort of financial reform or alternative finance, for example, suddenly will start talking to me about Bitcoin, right? Random people who will message me, on the web, sort of like hippie friends of mine who historically would be associated with sort of like, new age culture, are suddenly talking to me about like wanting to buy up all crypto stuff, and the fact that it will somehow revolutionize the world. Now this is crazy, right? Because for many years there's been a whole like active world of alternative economics, people trying to work on regenerative economies and so on, things that are actually ideologically much closer to what sort of, for example, like your hippie community might actually desire. And yet when something that's actually quite deeply conservative at a monetary level comes along, that's really capturing people's imaginations right now. So my political side is extremely worried about Bitcoin in terms of the messaging and the way that it's sort of capturing the people's angst, but then directing it away from actually doing anything. Now, of course, if you're in the Bitcoin community, this narrative really antagonizes you because you have a very strong desire to present yourself as being the antithesis of the system. So of course, nobody wants to be told that actually they're often reinforcing elements of that same system. But as mentioned, like there is a progressive way of presenting Bitcoin when you remove the monetary mythology and simply speak about it as being the sort of limited purpose counter-trade object. Okay, now that's sort of my line right now on Bitcoin. I'm probably going to end the video there because it's been like almost an hour of me talking about Bitcoin, but hopefully this sort of conveys some of my intuitions and angsts and sort of like the way I'm approaching it, right? Because and I guess I've been wanting to sort of stress this point about like I'm actually authentically interested in what you really could do with it, rather than the sort of linguistic mythological overlay that most of the Bitcoin industry relies upon. Okay, now one of the most scary elements, this is kind of what I ended up with the sort of the iToken piece sort of talking about, was how actually the Bitcoin industry has a fundamental interest in really like not exploring what Bitcoin really is, because it is predicated on a certain type of pumping these tokens to sell them for more money, all right, whilst presenting them as being money. So there's all this sort of crazy like massive economic interests right now caught up in presenting a particular story around Bitcoin, and that story is winning because that's what the media is using every time they speak about it. It's what politicians are using, and so that industry around Bitcoin has become extremely toxic and actively works against public understanding around Bitcoin, whilst presenting itself as almost being sort of the standard bearer of the Bitcoin movement, which is very, very disturbing. Okay, so albeit I don't quite know what to do about that other than writing these various pieces. So just if you want to go deeper into this and you want to go check out these pieces, I've spoken quite a lot today about the iToken piece, but the Countertrade piece is a sort of simpler and shorter piece, which will just give you the sort of basic description of how Countertrade works. But also go back and check that piece I did about Bitcoin time travel, where I was analyzing the ideology. And in that piece, I go more into the conservative perspective on money that it has, all right? So the way it sort of manipulates people's fear around monetary systems to present itself as being a savior in a certain way, when in reality, the actual ideology that surrounds the monetary part of Bitcoin comes from conservative shareholders and creditor classes in society, rather than your working classes, rather than your students, rather than your young people. All right. So yeah, I hope this made sense. And please give me any comments, and I shall be producing more pieces about this, but also bear in mind, I shall be looking at more progressive forms of crypto and what we can actually do with this stuff, which could actually be really, really useful in society, rather than just critiquing it as well. All right, catch you next time. Cheers.